All right, let's get started. So hopefully you can hear me okay. I turned on the podium mic, so I'll try to stand over here. But someone ran off with the lapel mic, so I have to kind of raise my voice a little bit. So if you can't hear me, and I say something you don't hear me, just let me know and I can repeat myself, and I apologize for that. Hopefully IST can bring a lapel mic in a few minutes, because if I have to talk at this volume all day, my next classes are going to be hard because it's going to wreck my voice. Okay, so last time, we were talking about some history of youth and childhood, and we got pretty much up to the present day in terms of, what we know about how it's developed, right? So we went from, at least in Postman's account, about 1440 and moving forward, where there really wasn't a notion of youth the way we had it, to today, right, where we have this really, really long idea of youth. All right, so I'm going to start off here. So what I want to do is we're going to end up talking about the cultural world of mostly millennials and Gen Z. What do these generations look like? And what does that tell us, in a sense, about the world that we live in? But I'm going to take a lot of material here from this book by Jean Twenge. If you know me, I really like Jean's work. I think it is absolutely top-notch when it comes to talking about young people. She wrote a book that we're going to talk about a fair bit called iGen. She's a major contributor to Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, which we'll talk about at the end of the term. And we're going to talk about, a lot of the information that she sort of talks about in terms of the different generations, what they were like and how they affected things to come from this book, Generations, which came out last year in March. And so it's a really, really interesting book, a pretty long read, but lots of really interesting information. Now, kind of like, in a sense, a little bit like Neil Postman, right? Her big focus is, though she comes from a different lens, right? She's a psychologist. She doesn't come at it from a media studies kind of background the way Postman does, but she too kind of looks at the world and how young people are being shaped. And she thinks that a major, probably the major contributor to the changes between our generations is technology, right? Okay, so basically she will suggest, and she calls this the technology model of generations. And she said that each generation is essentially defined by the core technologies that existed when they were young, right? So it's not that, say, the silent generation and the baby boomers don't experience smartphones. They obviously do. It's just that they don't experience them in the same way as, say, millennials or Gen Z will, because they don't come to them in those ultimately formative years, right? They come a little bit later in their lives, once their kind of patterns are already set. And yeah, technology, Twenge will say, affects pretty much everything, right? All aspects of social life, including family, education, work, leisure, religion, politics, and, mental health, which we're going to talk about a ton in the last third of the course. We're going to spend a ton of time talking about mental health, because this is a really, really big question around especially millennials and Gen Z. Is that a question, Karen? Okay, yeah, please. I thought I uploaded it. Let me double check. If it's not, let me fix that. I went and I uploaded it on Friday. If I did something stupid like forget to hit save, then maybe it's not. I don't know. What class is this? I know. I'm being dumb. All right. Now you can see what my E-class looks like.
You were just testing us.
Yes. Was I testing you or myself? Who knows? Okay. Let's have a quick look. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I messed that up. I always assume that if I just drag and drop things, it'll work out. Nope. All right, let me fix that. I'm sure for those watching at home, this is going great. Okay, let's delete that. And we'll delete that too. People at home have no idea what's going on. That's excellent. Okay. Oh, what's the easiest way to do this? Ah! Short, puppety. I'm losing the room at the moment. Okay. Of course. All right, now I'm going to hit Save Changes. And now that should be the right one. Okay, it is now correct. I'm really sorry about that. I went and I re-uploaded them, and I must have forgot to hit Save. And now I have to reopen everything. Okay, sorry, online people. Actually, you get to stay warm and home in your bed, so I'm not sorry about anything. All right, let's try that again. And again, I apologize for that. Okay, now you should be back. So, as I was saying, one of the things that Twenge will say is that when we talk about the kind of generations that we've had, right, we're looking at shorter and shorter kind of time periods between generations. And she ultimately thinks this is because the pace of technological change has gotten much quicker, right? And like, for example, when we talk about the smartphone, right, really smartphones, they existed before 2007, but the iPhone mainstreams them in 2007, you know, when Steve Jobs does his whole, and one more thing, this is the iPhone, and everybody kind of rushes out to buy it. That represents one of the fastest adoptions of a technology in human history, right? Especially mass adoption, because by 2012, half of people have a smartphone in the US, and it's something like 75% of teenagers and 90-some% of emerging adults have this new technology. So it's adopted very, very quickly. And she'll suggest that when we look at the dates, right, we have relatively long periods for, say, the silent generation, the baby boomers, shorter for Gen X, shorter for millennials, shorter for Gen Z, and then our generation after, which I won't talk about here because we don't really know anything about them yet from a sociological perspective, is what she calls the polars. Some people are calling them Gen Alpha. We don't know the end date of the polars just yet, but it's likely to be fairly short. Okay. And yeah, new technologies, she suggests, create generation gaps, right? And conflicts between different generations. Because there's a mutual misunderstanding or incomprehension as to what these new technologies mean and how they affect people's lives. Okay. So, the other theory that she draws from in this book that I think is really important to understand is what she calls life history theory. And it's an academic theory basically to describe how, like two basic modes of how you can raise children, right? And basically what she suggests is parents have a choice to an extent, not from like, say, an individual kind of basis, but more like society tends to make this choice for you, right? So what do you have? You have either, you can have many children, right? And expect them to grow up quickly, which is called the fast life strategy. So this is, she says, more common in societies with higher both infant, child, well, I guess not both, but all three, child, infant, and parental mortality, right? So if we categorize societies prior to, really the 1930s, we're probably looking at societies with, high child mortality, high infant mortality, and high parental mortality. And that all kind of lessens and lessens as we go forward. Okay, so what happens with a fast life strategy? Typically, you get married and you start having children early, right? So relatively quickly, you have children as young as you possibly can, and you have as many children as you can, hoping that, given that life expectancy is a lot shorter, they will mostly be self-sufficient, or at least some of them will be, before either the death of one or both parents, right? So that basically they're not relying on you for a long time. Okay, so I mean, well, interestingly, right, infant mortality in 1800 was 1 in 6. Today, right, in 2020, it's less than 1 in 200. And child mortality, right, dying in childhood, it was something like 1 in 14 children died before their 14th birthday. Today, it's somewhere around 1 in 300 to 1 in 400, depending on the year that you look at. So all these kinds of deaths have declined massively. And I mean, this is, antibiotics, better health care, better safety equipment. We saw spikes in all sorts of mortality when cars were invented, but as cars have gotten safer and safer, that mortality declines as well. So that's the fast life strategy, right? And this has been typical in most of human history, right? That you have a fast life strategy because things like childbirth were extremely dangerous for women. So maternal mortality was very high. Infant mortality, right? Huge numbers of babies died before their first birthdays, and a pretty large number died before their 5th birthdays from what we would today think of as preventable diseases, right? Even minor things like a cut that gets infected, right, could kill you not that long ago in human history. So you basically had to get married young, right, start having children as young as possible, get as many children kind of out as you could, and just kind of hope for the best, right? Hope that some of them would survive and some of them would be self-sufficient. Now, I mean, it's been suggested, though I don't think this is entirely true, that in a lot of cases, and Postman makes this case, kind of basing it off Philip Aries, who's a questionable source, that infant mortality and child mortality were so high that a lot of times a proper, what you would call a Christian name, or what you would think of as your first name, wasn't given. Oh, thank you. Is that going to be easy to hook in here?
Yeah, it's already ready to go.
Okay, perfect, because me shouting the whole time is going to... One of 4 classes today, so that's going to wreck my voice pretty quickly. Oh, thank you for bringing that so quickly. Wireless mics. Too echoey?
Could be this. Check. 1, 2. Check. 1, 2, 3, 4. You guys hear that okay?
That sounds good. All right, we can even turn it down a little.
Yeah. Test. 1, 2, 3, 4. Check.
Awesome. Thank you so
Sir.
much. I promise I will leave this here. I'm not taking it anywhere.
That is good. And nothing in there, right?
No, I looked in the cabinets. I looked under things, over things, all that jazz. I know the drill.
This is not the first time for this room, so.
Oh, fair enough. All right, thanks so much. That'll be so much better. Now I don't have to scream. All right, so that's the fast life strategy. Now, the opposite of that, right, is essentially the slow life strategy, right? So you can have fewer children and expect them to grow up more slowly, right? So this is typical when you have lower adult and infant and child mortality, right? Especially adult, because you're not expecting that your kids are going to be without you for the most part. Though, of course, it happens, right? Okay. Also kind of more typical of much more economically complex environments, right? Places where economies require specialized knowledge. And the more specialized the knowledge, the more education is typically required in order to thrive in a particular economic circumstance, right? So what ends up happening, right? We kind of talked about this, we're talking about this history of youth and childhood, right? When, nobody went to school in the Middle Ages, right? Or almost nobody. But we get to, 1660 and the Presbyterians are saying, we probably need compulsory public education that's available to everybody because that's how much the world's changing. By the time you hit the end of the Industrial Revolution, right, even more education is needed. And today now we're in what you would call a post-industrial period, right? We're principally a knowledge-based economy in the West. Education takes even longer, right? some people now saying like a master's is the new bachelor's degree, right? In terms of like a minimum qualification for a lot of jobs. Okay, so education takes longer. What Twenge will suggest is that in a lot of cases, resources in complex societies are relatively scarce, especially resources for economic thriving, right? Or people at least perceive them as scarce, that you need a lot of education, a lot of resources behind you in order to potentially compete for those really good paying jobs, right? For that happy kind of well-paying middle class life. It's going to take, there's scarce resources, fewer jobs, and the jobs that are there require more training. So what do parents do? They have fewer kids, right? Fewer kids, and they nurture them more. So when we hear the idea, right, that raising children is so expensive, right? This is what's kind of at stake, right? Why is raising children so expensive? It's ultimately so expensive because you're nurturing them, right? You're building up particular interests, particular skills, paying for them to be really well adjusted, to have a great education. You're paying for 4 years of university or something, right? At least 2 years of post-secondary of some kind. And so it takes a long time and it requires a lot of parental resources. Because parental resources aren't unlimited, right? The choice ends up being to have fewer children and spend more resources on those fewer children, right? So instead of having 5 kids, you have 2, and then you pour resources into those 2 kids, or 1 child, right? It's becoming much more typical. So yeah, you put all of those resources in there. Oh, I just thought of something, and I don't know how it now kind of escapes. It jumped out into my brain, and then it jumped out of my brain, which is helpful. I mean, this is really the situation that we're in today, right? We're in very much a slow life strategy. And we've seen this sort of ever expanding sort of notion of youth, right? And you start with Postman, there isn't one. And we get to the 19th century and all right, we're going to talk probably into your teens, and then some people are going to be involved in the economy. And then today, right, you're looking at almost in sociological terms, we've expanded this notion of youth, it's childhood, adolescence, and what we're now calling emerging adulthood, right? Which is going to take you right into your late 20s. You're still sort of young and being formed in a lot of cases, requiring input and resources from your parents. So this is a very, very slow life strategy that we have today, right? Which is why you're going to see things, right? When you look at millennials and Gen Z, things like the age of first marriage is going up steadily, right? Because you're not really fully adult in a sense, like in a sociological sense, right? Not in a biological or legal sense, but in a kind of sociological sense, you're still emerging into adulthood, right? You're spending much more time in school, right? This is where I'm like, the high school graduation is now kind of stupid, right? Because it's like, yay, you graduated from high school. Now you get to begin your life of more school. Yay, happy days, right? It used to be high school was the end. It's not really the end anymore. So we're in this moment of a slow life strategy. And so we're going to see this when we talk about, how different generations live their lives. It's this kind of slow cultural shift from a fast life strategy to a slow life strategy driven by technology and a bunch of them. Media in large part, economics in large part, what do you need to succeed in the economy, but also the fact that there just isn't the same rush, to get married and have children when your life expectancy, is going to be into your 70s for the most part, right? Okay. Oh, that can't be good. Okay, so let's talk about, oops, that should be born, not boon. I'll fix that later. The silent generation, right? Born 1925 to 1945, right? So this is about a 20-year generation. So you might think of this as the sort of, sometimes they're also called the lucky generation, because they had a lot of things going for them, right? They're sandwiched between the greatest generation and the baby boomers. They are a relatively small generation overall, right? Because, the biggest chunk of them are born during 2 kind of, epochal cataclysms in Western society, which is the Great Depression and the Second World War. Now, I know in a class about youth, talking about people born between 1925 and 1945 probably seems a little odd. The silent generation, they're all but gone, right? In terms of kind of their even being able to measure them on sociological studies, right, on things like the General Social Survey, they're disappearing really rapidly, right? I mean, at 1945, so the oldest of them now, are almost in their the youngest of them are almost in their 80s, right? So they're quite old now, but they were young once, and their youth was super influential. Okay, so yeah, they're often overlooked because they lived through the Depression, but mostly they were pretty young during the Depression. They didn't fight in the Second World War, right? Because they were for the most part, they were too young by the time the Second World War began. So a few of them might have, like the oldest of them, but for the most part, they didn't fight in the Second World War. Some of them would have fought in Korea, in the Korean War, but mostly kind of avoided major wars for the most part. They also lived through the Great Depression, but a lot of times when they're coming into adulthood, right, when they're hitting, the oldest of them are hitting 20, they're coming into the period of almost seemingly unending economic prosperity and growth that followed the Second World War, right? And peace, a very, very kind of peaceful time. So, like I said, sometimes called the lucky generation because they avoided a lot of the really terrible things that happened to other generations. Okay. They're also probably the generation that drove the cultural transformations in Western culture the most, right? So, we often think of the baby boomers as this radical generation, who embraced feminism and transformed things and, were involved in civil rights changes and, changes for, principally gay and lesbian people when we're talking about the silence. But eventually that would come to include, transgender people much, much later and bisexual and all of that stuff, right? Most of the kind of big social changes start with the silent generation, right? So, for example, right, the people who led the counterculture movement were silent. And these are some of the names, right? You might recognize Gloria Steinem, right? A very famous feminist. So like the early days of the kind of women's liberation movement, the anti-war movement in the US, and a lot of the other counterculture movements that went with that, the sexual revolution, was driven by silent generation, right? A lot of the prominent media figures that ultimately were an inspiration to the baby boomers, right? And drove, the kind of Woodstock hippie movement, the emergence of rock and roll as a major genre were themselves silenced, right? So Jimi Hendrix, right? Janis Joplin, and all of the members of the Beatles were all members of the silent generation. They're not baby boomers. They're born before that. Basically all of these movements that started, transforming society in the US, which happened mostly between 1963 and 1970, were driven by the silence, most of whom were in their 20s at the time, right? Some of them would have been moving into their 30s, but most of them were in their 20s. So they transformed the landscape of American culture, certainly. And along with it, the whole world. Okay. They're the beginning of this long kind of march towards greater and greater individualism and a transformation of Western culture, particularly American in this case, but the way this goes is as goes America, so goes the rest of the world for the most part, or at least the rest of the West. So they start this march towards greater and greater individuality and less focus on kind of questions of collective good or the what do they call social goods, right? Collectivism is replaced by individualism. Okay, so what Twenge kind of points out is that one of the key technologies for them is television, right? So TV comes onto the scene as a major technology in the 1950s, somewhere around 1952, 1953. It's sort of the beginnings of mainstream television broadcast where a lot of people are buying them in the US. And what she'll suggest, and I think this is true, is it really broadens people's perspective, right? It takes you from the kind of parochial or your own kind of community and opens the rest of the world in ways that were hard to imagine before, right? And it brings it into the home. too. It brings this new technology into the home so you can experience, right, what's going on, say, in Vietnam, in the war in Vietnam, in your own home. There were things like, newsreels in movie theaters before, but people didn't go to the movies that often. Okay, jet and space travel, obviously, shrink the world, right? Jet travel in particular makes the world a much smaller place. It's now possible for you to go to Europe in a few hours, right? As opposed to, taking a steamship across the Atlantic. Now you can fly, right? You can take a jet aircraft, you leave New York and 8 hours later you're in London. So it shrinks the world in fundamental ways. And this will only get, as the silents get older and older, this will only expand, right? It's only going to make the world smaller and smaller and travel faster and faster, with more people traveling and experiencing more and different cultures, right? Out of your own kind of parochial setting, again, is the kind of important thing. And you get the growth of eventually the service economy and the shift away from an economy based on manufacturing and other forms of manual labor, which ends up being really, really transformative for women, right? Because it creates a lot of job opportunities for women. Not that women can't do labor and heavy manufacturing and all of these things, but they're more stereotypically male professions, and a lot of them require just physical strength. Once you open up a lot of service industry jobs, especially high-paying ones, it means there's a lot of room in the economy for women, and women to enter not just low-paid professions, but really high-paid professional positions where they're going to do very well. And so you'll see with the silents, right, they're the first generation where you really often have, say, you get the beginnings of it anyway, women returning to the workforce after they have their children, and often balancing kind of work out in kind of the professional sphere and all of the domestic tasks they still have to do at home. Okay, and yeah, like I said, gradually the mentality shifts from idea of social rules and duties to individual rights. And you get the breakdown of a bunch of, very old kind of systems of rules, right? So you get, we talked about it last class, the end of segregation in the US South, right? More inclusion of women in the workforce, right? Especially in professions where they'd been actively discriminated against. Even professional positions like medicine, engineering, and the STEM fields, right? It doesn't stop, but it starts to decline with the silence entering these fields, right? And again, it's gonna be a long time before, and even today, right? Lots of people I know would argue that there's still a lot of sexism, say, in the law or in engineering, but it starts to decline. It becomes less acceptable, right? Yeah, and so by the 1970s, when basically the silents are mostly, becoming adults, they're mostly having children, a lot of the rules that had been set socially that separated people, that, you could say were oppressing certain people's rights, have started to change, right? Now, again, I want to say started to change because there's obviously a long way to go. And yeah, later born silents, so the ones born more towards the middle of the 1940s, were the first to experience more than a third of their mothers working when they're school-aged. Okay, yeah. That said, you definitely still have a kind of, with the silence, a really sort of strange shift, right? Because it's not a complete shift to a fast life strategy. In a lot of cases, a slow life strategy. It's very much still a fast life strategy. And this, I kind of alluded to it, a few classes ago. The silents, in a lot of ways, are very conventional too. They're revolutionary and conventional, which is kind of an odd thing, but it's just the way it kind of is, right? What the kind of typical social script around marriage for the silents was: you graduate from college if you're going to college, or high school if you're not planning to continue, and then you get married very shortly thereafter, right? So the age of first, and this is kind of weirdly reversed the social trend, right? Driven by the prosperity, like the economy just goes absolutely nuts right about here because of, the post-war shift to commercial products, and the fact that the US and Canada are providing goods to the rest of the world, which basically spent the 1940s bombing, the early part of the 1940s bombing itself into oblivion, right? It's a time of huge economic opportunity. And so, you get, for the first time really in a long time, this is median age at first marriage, right? It kind of jumped at 1940 when there's the war, but then it really declines, to almost historic lows by the 1950s, right? So that's for women. For men, right, it declines as well. And you're getting ages of first marriage, on average, so there's a lot below that as well, somewhere around 21 for women, and then at its low, about 23 or 22 and a half for men, right? So why were people doing this, right? So I guess reaching a low of 20.1 for women in 1956, right? And like I said a few classes ago, half of new brides were teenagers in the 1950s, right? So, I mean, most of these are 18 and 19. There are certainly, what you might call shotgun weddings, of younger teenagers getting married, though that's not super common still. 18, 19, though, quite common for them to get married and start having children really quickly. And yeah, I mean, why did they get married? They got married because everyone else was doing it, right? Because it was a sort of social script. And this is actually well known for human beings, right? Like, amongst other things, if you're female and either your best friend or your sister, starts having children, gets pregnant, the odds that you're going to get pregnant in the next 2 years increase dramatically from a statistical point of view, because we follow the scripts of the people around us, right? So in the 1950s, everyone's getting married pretty young, and so that's just what everyone does, right? They get married quite young. Okay. I said, that they had a lot of babies. Yeah, the most common family form the Silents experience, and this might surprise you, so what they experienced growing up, the most common family forms were 2 children, right? Like basically like a nuclear family like you might see in the suburbs of Edmonton in 2024. Really, 2 parents, 2 kids, a dog. That was pretty common for the Silents as well, right? And you had seen kind of declines in fertility for a long time prior to the Silent generation, right? There'd been this kind of 200-year decline in fertility, or in the total fertility rate up till that point. And the Silents kind of reverse all of that, right? So again, you start in 1945 here with the end of the war, and you see this huge spike, kind of spikes, where does it say? 1958 is the peak of it, right? Where the average children per woman was 3.8, which you only see today in typically, developing economies, right? Very developing economies, and like theocracies, right? This is typically where you see birth rates, above 3. It's really, really uncommon in the modern world. But it spiked, up and up, and kind of peaks over here in 1958 at 3.8 children per woman, and doesn't return, down to around where it was in 1900, right, until, 1968, right? So right about here. So it lasts for a really long time. And this confused demographers to no end, because they had expected, right, that you would have this brief period where they thought soldiers were returning from the Second World War, and you would have the phenomenon of the hello baby, right, where you come home and you haven't seen your wife in a while and you get her pregnant right away, so there's a spike in fertility, and then they figured as life returns to normal, it would, or your high school sweetheart or whatever, it would return to normal. But it lasts a really, really long time, right, from 1945 all the way really until, the end of it. Most people put the end of the baby boom at about 1963, where it starts to get back towards, this point. But it really doesn't return to its 1900 level until 1968. So it lasts, almost 2.5 decades, right? It lasts a really, really long time. Now, for women, right, they go back to work. You still have this kind of strange world for women in lots of cases where they might be working full-time and still expected to do, virtually all of the domestic tasks in the home. So there's a lot of stressed out mothers in this period as well. They may have 3 to 6 kids. They're working and they're, cooking, cleaning, doing laundry and all of that. Now, a lot of that has been made easier by by labor-saving devices, the washing machine, the dishwasher, all of that jazz, but still a lot of weight on women. So this is where you start to get the idea that women have, what they call the double day or the second shift, right? They do their shift at work and then they do their shift at home, right? Where they're doing all the domestic labor and work of social reproduction. Okay, this goes way beyond when they're young, but I think it's worth kind of talking about anyway. One of the things that's true of the silent generations is they've been remarkably, through their lives, resilient to anxiety in a way that we actually have a lot of trouble, and mental illness in ways that we have a lot of trouble kind of explaining. They haven't been as depressed. Their suicide rates have been lower. Their rates of reported mental illness and anxiety all have remained relatively low. And you see, right, this black line, so what is this? This is, I don't have the chart here, but this is reported levels of anxiety. Those born 1945 and before, that's the silence. It's much lower than the baby boomers, right? Okay. So one of the theories that Twenge kind of puts forward is that this was a very socially connected generation, right? They grew up in a completely analog world where they made deep social connections with other human beings. They had large families as well, which tended to sort of link them in to lots of people, right? Their children, their grandchildren, and all of this. So through their life course, they've been remarkably resilient to anxiety and depression. Okay, the baby boomers. The baby boomers. Oh my. What have we here? So the baby boomers, I talked about them a little bit already. In terms of, this is the generation where in the US, right, between these dates, 46 and 64, that's where Twenge puts the range. You have, 76 million people born. In Canada, it's 8.6. So a huge demographic kind of bulge. Okay, so it does start at the end of the First World War. This is the kind of culmination of the greatest generation. A lot of the parents of the boomers are greatest generation, right? So the generation that fought in the war. And eventually some of the older silent generation pushed the baby boom as well. So it's very, very long and sustained, right? So by the time it ended, 76 million Americans had been born, more than the population of France and more than half the total population of Russia today, right? And it's a reversal of 200 years of declining birth rates. They basically will end up dominating the social landscape and the political landscape, every single landscape, the cultural landscape at every stage of their life. And you can see, right, these are little charts showing you where they are, on the demographics, right? And this, if you look at this chart at the top, historically, it's a very normal population chart, right? Why? Because you have lots of young people and not that many old people, right? It kind of goes, it's roughly a triangle here. And that's what you typically want a population to sort of look like because, generally younger people need to support older people economically. And so, if you have more younger people than older people, that works out really, really well. The boomers sort of screw all of that up in major ways, right? Like this, as they move into their middle age, right? There is a huge chunk of boomers in here. And this has all sorts of impacts for people, right? Who are coming, not so much who are older than them, but who come after them in the generational kind of cohorts, right? So Gen X particularly, and then older millennials. Because, there's so many people in here, they end up dominating a lot of the jobs, right? As the economy slows down, particularly in the 1970s, the boomers are dominating the job market, and they're far from retirement, right? So they're going to be in there for a long time. And we're just seeing now the boomers finally starting to retire and make more room in the economy for other generations. And then, this is a very problematic, this is 2020's US population. This is a very, very problematic demographic chart because you have, here almost as many older people, and they're going to keep moving up here, requiring more medical care and social security and all of that, and basically almost as many as you have young people, right? you have more people 25 to 29, and obviously these will get smaller as they start to die. There's still a ton of people in here. So there's a lot of older people that have to be supported by younger people. So if you wonder why, the Canadian government, starting in the beginning of January, raised your CPP contributions, that's why, right? It's because the baby boomers are moving into their retirement years, and this is an unfunded liability. The federal government does not have enough money to fund things like the Canada Pension Plan for all of these boomers moving into their retirement years, right? Now, you'll probably benefit from it, when you turn like 70, but you're going to be paying a lot of extra CPP in the meantime, right? And it's the same in the US, right? Things like this is the US, Canada's looks very similar. If you look at Social Security in the US, the Social Security should be bankrupt somewhere in the 2030s, right? Basically, they're not going to have enough money unless they raise Social Security contributions. Because as the boomers move into here, there's so many of them, there's not enough young workers. So it affects young people in all sorts of ways. So the silent generation had too many babies and it screwed everything up. Or subsequent generations didn't have enough babies and it screwed everything up. Who knows? Actually, both of those things are true. Okay, so yeah, how am I doing for time? Oh, I'm doing so good. I've covered so much ground today. The boomers, they internalized a lot of the changes that the silent generation started, right? Especially around things like race, women's rights. And I say here gay and lesbian rights because I think, bisexual and transgender and everything that comes after that, for millennials and Gen X and Gen Z really starts just with gay and lesbian rights and then sort of branches out from there. So, they were big on rejecting what they saw as outdated prejudices, and individual choice and individuality is really at the core of baby boomer values. And this, of course, will pick up more and more with the Gen Xers, and then millennials and Gen Z take that to the next level in most cases. And they valued a lot of rule breaking traditional rules. Around sexuality is a big one. Around divorce as well is also a huge one, right? So most boomers in 1970 said it was okay to have sex before marriage, while most silent generation and greatest generation said no. And obviously this just increases more and more. And in 1970, it's like bare majority. It's about 56%. Still a majority say it's okay to have sex before marriage. 85% of adults said sex before marriage was wrong in 1967. By 1979, it's 37%. So when the boomers are well and truly, into adulthood, they bring that average way, way down. Drug use became really common and acceptable for the boomers. By Gen X, that reverses, right? As some of the problems with rampant drug use become apparent. But for the boomers, it was completely okay to experiment with drugs, principally marijuana, but all sorts of drugs, psychedelics especially, were on the agenda as well. Okay, so they were the first, raised with television at the center of their lives, right? While the silents had brought television in, they had grown up without television, right? For them, radio would have been a much more typical medium that was dominant for their lives. But for the boomers, it's television, right? And again, it's so important that it shows in visual ways what's happening in the world. It shows people, other parts of the world, other people's perspectives, and I realize I put no question slides in today. Oh dear, I should go back very quickly. Oh good, there are no questions. Perfect. Well, I was worried for nothing. I will fix that next time. Sorry. So they showed in very visual ways it's happening in the world. And right, like images of things like the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, the sort of bombing of Vietnam with incendiary rounds and things like napalm is shown viscerally on television, which polarizes people against the Vietnam War because it shows all the horrors of war. Which is really interesting. Sorry, I had a random thought, which I probably shouldn't explore, but I'm going to. It's really interesting because now, you can go on Twitter and see, images of war, and it doesn't seem to polarize people in the same way. Maybe we've become too accustomed to it because we play at war with things like Call of Duty, which is really realistic in some ways. Okay. As I said before, in last class, birth control becomes really important for the boomers, right? Obviously, the silent generation picked it up too, and this is what causes the decline. And yeah, please, sorry. Like they were polarized in this period?
Yeah, when you say like that we were able to see the horrors and it polarized them.
Okay, so I mean, what it creates is a really strong push, especially amongst young people who are at risk of being conscripted to military service. That they don't want anything to do with going to Vietnam, right? And fighting in this war and causing the kind of death and destruction that they're seeing on television. It humanizes the Vietnamese as well, right? They see them as just people. There's this super famous picture of the My Lai massacre. And maybe I'll throw it in the slides for next time just so you can see it, of a little girl who's naked, like running out of this village that's been bombed with incendiary, I think it's with napalm, right? The village is on fire and she's running towards the cameraman. And it's just like, so older generations are still broadly in favor of the Vietnam War as this anti-communist struggle, but the boomers become really polarized against it, right? They don't want it, and they don't want to go serve in this war, right? They don't want to be, the oldest of the boomers are coming into their 20s, right? They don't want to go serve in Vietnam. They don't want to be conscripted. And so it creates this really strong polarization, right? Where you have part of society that's very patriotic and like, no, we must fight the commies here, there, everywhere. And part of it's like, all I am saying is give peace a chance, right? And songs are written about it in the kind of popular culture of the time. Other questions? No? Okay. Yeah, so I talked about the labor-saving devices as well, right? For the boomers, these are really important. And again, it was important for the silent generation as well. But far less time is spent in domestic tasks than previous generations, right? You can throw things in the washing machine. You don't have to scrub every shirt on a washboard. So one of the things that happens is that expands consumer culture in ways that I think we can fail to appreciate. If you have a washing machine that can wash your 400 shirts, or however many, I probably do, if you count all the t-shirts and undershirts I have like 400 shirts at home or something crazy. If you have a washing machine that could do that, right, you'll buy a lot more clothing because you can take care of it much more easily. I mean, I think I remember my mom saying that my grandparents basically had like, 3 shirts, right? 2 for work and 1 for like Sundays, right? That was my grandfather. He was older. He's probably more greatest than the silent generation. Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's not important. My family history is not the point of this class. But you have a lot more possibility of consumerism, right? Goods get cheaper as everything starts to be made in factories, right? All the clothing moves from, more produced domestically to produced in factories. And you can take care of it much more easily. Having all this clothing doesn't mean you're going to have to wash all of it by hand. All right. So yeah, that opens up women's lives a lot. Oh, I can do this one really fast, and then we'll pick this up from here next time. For boomers, individualism starts as the focus, right? They start to become really focused. So by the time that most of them are having children, right, they move into this period away from sort of rejecting social rules into a kind of era of self-discovery, and where, basically being an individual and being unique becomes really, really important. And this will have an effect on the millennials, who are mostly the children of the boomers. So, names, right? You see this in names, and this kind of expands over time as well. In 1880, half of boys were given only 10 names, right? So 50% of the male population had 10 names. 1 in 4 girls, right? So a quarter of girls had, the 10 most popular names. 100 years later, when the baby boomers start naming their children, only 1 in 5 have the most popular names, and you get an expansion of name forms. And since 2010, it's only 1 in 14. And this is my favorite. The unique spellings really start with the millennials, but it grows and grows, right? Because why? It goes from names as being something that you use to fit in and be like everyone else, to now your name has to be your unique identifier for your whole life. And so you get this gradual shift, starting with the boomers, into my child has to be this perfect snowflake with, and there's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying that in a derisive way. With its unique name, right? Every snowflake is different. Every snowflake has a unique name. All right, I'm out of time. We'll pick it up. We'll talk about the crappy mental health that boomers have. That'll be super fun. All right, we'll see you on Wednesday.